Welcome to History Hack. If you didn't know by now, we are the revolution. That means we're sharp, witty, lots of fun, but it also means that we're essentially the peasants in Les Mis huddled round a table in the corner of the bar with no money. If you enjoy the show, please do support us. We have a Patreon account by which you can donate a small monthly sum in appreciation of what you're hearing. Alternatively, we have Ko-fi, in which you can just do a one-off donation as a thank you if you particularly enjoy a certain episode. Either way, we massively appreciate all of your support. Hope you enjoy the show. Hello and welcome to today's History Hack. We're going to Chris's happy place today. Where is your happy place, Chris?
Yes, today we're going to be talking about Germany, but not modern Germany or the Kaiserreich.
No.
We have, thankfully, we have Oliver Volckart, who is a professor of economic history and a historian whose previous works include, and I'm not going to recount the German ones because my pronunciation will embarrass me, State Building by Bargaining for Monopoly of Rents, The Political Economy of Agricultural Protection, and Sweden in Sweden 1887. But he's here today to talk to us about his new book, The Silver Empire, How Germany Created Its First Common Currency. So, Oliver, welcome to History Hack. How are you?
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, I'm very well. How are you?
Yeah, not bad, actually. Quite enjoying it. The weather outside is quite nice. I might go for a walk later.
Yeah, bit of sunshine and it's becoming warmer.
Yes.
Yep, spring is definitely coming. We are not economic historians, and it did not occur to me until about 30 seconds ago that common currency hundreds of years ago wasn't necessarily a thing. And that's asked, like, there's all these questions in my head now about how you pay for things. So what are the monetary problems faced by the Holy Roman Empire? And we're talking about 1519, aren't we? So we're talking about 10 years after the dreaded Henry VIII comes to the throne, roughly.
That's right.
So when he's still young and thin and not mad.
Yeah, so we are basically talking about the time period of Henry VIII and the early years of, Elizabeth. That's roughly the period about which we are talking, and conditions in the Holy Roman Empire, which covered, of course, all modern Germany, but also some other regions in Central Europe. Were entirely different in many ways from England. The country was much more decentralized. It was decentralized to a degree that, makes me interpret the political system as a kind of system of multilateralism, in many ways quite similar to what we today have in the European Union. And the monetary problems about which you were asking were basically, to a very large extent, a direct result of this decentralization. The parallel circulation of money that had been issued by many lots of different political authorities. And this under conditions where no real currency borders existed. That was nowhere the case in Europe before the 19th century. Basically, this is a commodity money system where money is not only based on gold and silver, where it is being made of gold and silver. And if that's the case, obviously, currency borders are very, very difficult to establish, because imagine you are living in London in the 16th century or even later, and you're selling something to a merchant from France, and the merchant from France offers you in return for the good that you are selling a French gold coin. Why should you reject that? It's made of gold. That's precious metal. So there are no currency borders. And the consequence of this lack of currency borders, not only in the empire, within the empire, but in Europe in general, was that rulers tended, or governments tended, to produce money that looked very much like money produced by their neighbors, in many cases, but that contained less precious metal. And some consumers noticed this difference. They noticed that there was good money about and bad money about. Some contained more precious metal than other money, even though these things looked very, very similar. Whereas the majority of consumers didn't really notice this, at least not immediately. And that allowed people who were well informed about the intrinsic value of money, about the content of gold and silver, basically to fool consumers by passing on poor money in place of good money, by withdrawing good money from circulation, melting it down selling it to some mint that used it as raw material for shoddy imitations by melting it down, mixing the metal with some more copper or lead or whatever base metal, and reissuing this as imitations of better money that had been produced by their neighbors. This is a phenomenon that economic historians call Gresham's law. It's called Gresham's law because Thomas Gresham was a financial advisor of Elizabeth I and a banker here in London. Was one of the first people to really describe this phenomenon. He was not the very first; it was quite well known before him, but he described it. And when economists came across his writings in the 19th century, they called this phenomenon Gresham's law after Thomas Gresham, and that is something that happened all over the place. Bad money replaced good money in circulation, and that was something that was going on everywhere, and that basically led to a race to the bottom where the quality of money was concerned. And this was the main problem from which money in Europe, but in particular in the empire, was suffering.
So if I'm Joe Bloggs on the street then, and I'm holding a handful of money, I don't actually know what I've got. I can turn up somewhere, I can try and pay for it, and that person, I could be like, I've got enough money to buy food for my family for a week. I go to the shop, I buy the food, they look at my money and they say, no, that's crap. That's been melted down and mixed with lead and I don't want it. And suddenly I'm broke.
Yep,
that's
something like that can happen. Yep, and you can imagine that is really quite unpleasant.
So how do people day to day deal with this then?
Well, most people were really not aware of the intrinsic value of the bullion content, gold and silver content of the money they handled, and tended to accept everything as, well, the same kind of money that looked broadly the same, that looked broadly similar, and had roughly the same weight. So something like this would happen if you encountered someone who was really well informed about the intrinsic value of money, a money changer, a big merchant who knew about these things, a goldsmith, for example, who had the technical knowledge to check the correct bullion content of the coinage. People like that. If you encountered people like that, your money might be rejected. Occasionally, also if you encountered someone else. But most people were used to using money just like we do today. The technical term is they were using money by tail. That is, they were focusing on its nominal value and not on its intrinsic value. However, there was always the chance that you would get into trouble if you tried to do that. That you would encounter someone who knew and that that person would reject your money or would accept it only at a discount or would demand higher prices, would demand you to pay a higher sum and things like that. And if that happened repeatedly, then there would be really serious trouble. I mean, it's remarkable that most of the peasant rebellions that shook Central Europe, in particular Southwest Germany in the early 16th century, were also motivated by monetary trouble. So peasants always complained about bad money with which they were being paid. And if that was done consistently and repeatedly, that might easily cause a rebellion. And that did cause rebellions in several places. So this was something that could become very, very unpleasant, not only for consumers who were forced to use poor money, but also for political authorities who wanted to avoid rebellions, of course.
And it was when the empire were trying to come up with a solution, they refer to, quote unquote, the common man, which is quite strange for this sort of period. So what kind of thing did they come out of it?
You mean the identity of the common man? Well, it's a term that was used in a very, very broad sense, and that none of the contemporaries ever really defined. So we have to sift through lots and lots of sources to discover who really was meant with this by this term. So one thing is certain. It's males only. So people were not thinking of women if they talked of the common man. That goes without saying. Then we know that political authorities used this term when they referred to their subjects, but not to all subjects. So, for example, servants were not considered to be part of the common man. Soldiers, mercenaries were not considered to be part of the common man. Also, the ruling oligarchies of commercial centers and towns were not meant. So basically, if people were talking of the common man, what they had in mind was, well, honest, hardworking peasants, craftsmen, people like that, people who did manual work and who earned their livelihood in that way. That is what people meant when they were talking of the common man.
I was just saying it's quite encompassing then, because often in Britain, when you say the common man, it means everyone above a certain class, and that doesn't include peasants. So even if you're tilling the field, you're not one of the common man. But in Germany, you would count as a common
Yes.
man.
Yeah. And
In terms of fixing this, then, is it as simple as the Holy Roman Emperor, who in my head I have a vision of Catherine of Aragon's nephew, the one with the massive chin,
yes.
Charles? Is it as simple as him saying, right, this is rubbish, this is how we're going to fix it, this is what we're going to do, and everybody does as they're told?
No, it's not quite that simple. not really. Well, the empire was really very, very decentralized. And from the late 15th century onward, many of the princes of the empire and many free cities, governments of free cities, noticed that they had to do something about that and had to make the system more workable, or had to create a system that worked. So there was a constitutional reform movement in the years around 1500 and the decades thereafter. And what emerged was a kind of constitution that made this decentralized system workable. But the emperor was only one part of that constitution. So in order, for example, to pass a bill, the emperor had to sign off that bill. That goes without saying. But the bill would be, well, the result of a very complex political process that, involved many political authorities within the empire. The forum where bills and laws, including monetary laws, was discussed was the imperial diet, a gathering of representatives of all the governments within the empire, of all the princes who governed the empire and the free cities. And these diets would take place every few years, maybe every other year, maybe a bit more rarely. They would take months, where all kinds of issues were being discussed. The attendants at these diets were grouped into several houses, as it was called, very much like in England, where there is, the Commons and the House of Lords. In Germany, in the Empire, there were 3 such houses. One was composed of the 7 princes who were empowered to elect the emperor for life, normally. The other encompassed all other princes, ecclesiastical princes, just as well as temporal princes. And the third house was composed of representatives of the free cities. And when all 3 houses agreed on a law and submitted that law to the emperor, and when the emperor had signed off that law, then that law would be in force formally. How it was enforced on the ground was an entirely different question, of course. So this is relatively complex. It's a system that works very much in many respects like modern multilateral systems like the European Union. It does make life better for people living within its framework, but it's not easy and it doesn't work perfectly.
Because you've got all even though it's an empire, it's still made up of all the separate sort of states, including Austria, and so trying to get everyone, it's like herding cats, I suppose, trying to get everyone to follow the rules.
Exactly. Yeah.
And then on top of that, you've also got the with Spain going into South America, they suddenly bring lots of silver into Europe. How does the silver rush then affect the empire?
Well, the silver rush is something that actually begins a little bit earlier. And it doesn't begin in South America. It begins within the empire, in the Tyrol, in the Alps, in the border regions between Saxony and Bohemia, nowadays the Czech Republic, or much of the Czech Republic, and in what back then was called Upper Hungary, which is nowadays Slovakia. And it was in the late 15th century, in the years around 1470, 1475, that new silver deposits were discovered in this region, or that known silver deposits began to be exploited for the first time. And that led to a huge increase in the output of silver. And the relevant thing is that this gave some of the princes of the empire, those who controlled these mining districts, special interest in mining and in the production of silver, because their revenues were derived from that. It also had further effects. It increased the quantity of silver in circulation relative to the quantity of gold, which implies that silver became less valuable relative to gold, and gold became more valuable. And this again had consequences, for example, for princes who were indebted. Debts were normally denominated in gold. Now, with much new silver entering the market, gold was becoming, well, more valuable in terms of silver. Silver was becoming less valuable. If you had to service your debts in gold, it became ever more complex and more expensive to buy the gold you needed to service your debts. And this is one reason why many of these princes were really, really unhappy with the increase in the quantity of silver that entered the market. And obviously, once American silver began to enter the market from the middle of the 1540s onward, the situation became even more serious for princes who were indebted and who had to service their debts in gold.
So I think I'm going to ask a question that sounds stupid, but I am stupid on this subject, and I think other people will be too. Why is it silver and not gold?
Well, that's a question of geography. There are silver deposits in Europe. There are very few gold deposits. There were a few gold mines in Silesia, which is nowadays southwestern Poland. Also a little bit in Upper Hungary, nowadays Slovakia, but not much. Most of the gold that entered Europe, originated in West Africa, south of the Sahara, had to be transported across the Sahara, across the Mediterranean, and then entered Europe. But Europe was producing a lot of silver, very little gold. And in the 16th century, the relative value of gold went up because the quantity of silver that was available increased as a consequence of the mining boom.
But then as well, because of Spain and obviously a bit later, you get a flood of gold coming in from South America. Does that have an impact on it?
Well, it's not so much gold that's coming from South America. There is a little bit, of course. I mean, the Spanish conquer the Aztec Empire in the early 1520s, and 15 years later they conquer the Inca Empire, and they loot and plunder and melt down all the gold that the indigenous cultures in the Americas had amassed, and they transport much of that to Europe. Of course, there is some, but most of the precious metal mined in the Americas, both in Mexico, for example, in Zacatecas, or in Peru, in Potosi, nowadays in Bolivia, back then in Peru, that was silver too. And the output of American silver mines was much, much larger than anything that European silver mines could produce. So from the 1540s onwards, 1550s, huge amounts of silver entered Europe and increased the price of gold even more.
So they do attempt to create a common currency. How does that first attempt go?
Well, the first attempt was actually made the first real attempt was made in the 1550s, in the early 1550s, 1551. That was the outcome of this contortionist political process that I've just described, where the imperial diet was involved and hundreds of princes and free cities and so on. And they agreed on a bimetallic system, on a bimetallic common currency. A bimetallic common currency is a currency where gold and silver circulate side by side at fixed rates. So one gold piece is always the equivalent of 10 silver pieces, for example. That's by law. And they wanted a system like that. And the reason why they wanted it was that so many princes of the empire were heavily indebted and had to service their debts that were denominated in gold. So they wanted to put a stop to the further increase of the price of gold. That is why they were interested in a fixed ratio of gold to silver and in a bimetallic currency. This did not work. There were some important princes who never accepted that, in particular those whose income depended on gold, and that were the princes who controlled the Rhine. The Rhine was the most important transcontinental trade route that linked Italy and the Netherlands, the two economic poles of Europe. A lot of gold flowed along the Rhine, and They taxed trade on the Rhine. They collected gold. They were not interested in, a fixed ratio of gold to silver. They were interested in a further increase in the value of gold. So they never really accepted that. And that was the main reason why this currency failed in the early 1550s. Another attempt that took place a few years later, towards the end of the decade, was much more successful. But that established an entirely different currency system, one where gold and silver could circulate side by side, but at flexible rates. And that worked then.
That's fascinating, isn't it? So the second attempt is what? Because I guess as well, do you have to start suddenly thinking about how you police these people that are melting down currency and introducing substandard currency into the market? Have you then got to come up with a whole infrastructure to kind of stop them?
Yes, yeah. That's exactly what was established here at the end of the 1550s. So what the empire introduced was not only legislation, which defined this new currency that was introduced back then, it also introduced mechanisms to make sure that this currency would work. And the trick was that, the members of the empire who were issuing money were expected and supposed to meet twice yearly to supply specimens of the money that they had issued. And these specimens were then tested by experts in metallurgy and tested whether they contained as much gold and silver as they were supposed to contain. And the trick was that these meetings where the money was to be tested were not only attended by princes of the empire and free cities who issued money, but also by those who did not issue money. And there were always some of those who entirely depended on the money produced by their neighbors. And these members of the empire, these princes who didn't produce their own money, and the cities that didn't produce their own money, were obviously strongly interested in detecting underweight imitations. And they would bring these imitations to the attention of the meetings, and then princes who had produced underweight imitations were basically censured and their mint was closed down. And that worked very, very effectively for at least, I would say 4 or 5 decades.
Wow.
Actually, until the beginning of the 30 Years' War, when the system broke down.
Yeah, 30 years, though. That's quite impressive for any system across such a decentralized mass.
Well, the euro has not yet been about for such a long period of time, so let's see how that plays out. But I'd say compared to the euro, this common currency of the empire worked reasonably well. And it certainly made life a lot easier for the consumers.
And in your book, you said you focus on a lot of people rather than on the concepts. But so who were the most important players in the currency revolution?
Well, obviously, Charles V, the emperor, plays a large role. That goes without saying, basically. And I mean, given that he was indebted, really, even more than anybody else, he was strongly interested in the bimetallic currency, which is why he really made the effort to implement this at the beginning of the 1550s and failed. His younger brother, Ferdinand, was equally important. Ferdinand was basically Charles' right-hand man in the empire. Charles was, of course, not only emperor, he was also king of Spain. And when he was in Spain or elsewhere abroad, which was actually much of the time, the empire was governed by his younger brother Ferdinand, and Ferdinand was also his successor. And Ferdinand was a quite different character. Charles was always a bit, let's say, aloof and not very sociable, and with tendency to make authoritarian decisions, the big clunking fist and things like that. So that was his style. Ferdinand was entirely different. He was more of a society man. He liked talking. He liked music. He liked eating in company and things like that. And he was much more popular among the princes of Germany and among the free cities too. And I think this is one reason why his attempt to create a working currency really was a success. He was more popular. He was more willing to compromise. his willingness to compromise was acknowledged by everybody, and that laid really the groundwork for the success of that currency. There were, of course, other important players. There was, for example, the Elector of Saxony, Maurice of Saxony, who was one of the princes who controlled a silver mining district, an important silver mining district, and who always was very wary and reluctant to enter any agreements concerning the currency, because back then, up to then, Saxony had used its own currency quite successfully. There were other important players at the regional level, but I think the emperor, his brother, the Elector of Saxony, these were the most important people, really. And of course, there were minor players like, if there was a currency conference, if the emperor, for example, called a currency conference where the members of the empire sent delegates to discuss currency affairs, the emperor would send, his commissioners to chair the talks. And, for example, the Bishop of Speyer, which is a place on the Rhine, south of Frankfurt, or a certain count from central Germany. And they would then, of course, influence the talks and the discussions, and that would also have consequences.
People famously hate change, don't they? Did you manage, because obviously you're an economic historian. We don't touch a lot of economic history on History Hack because we're terrified of it because we don't understand it. Just finally, do you see anywhere in the work that you do kind of a progression between people kind of coming to accept it and getting used to it and appreciating it in the end? Yeah. And is it a gradual process, or are they straight from the beginning finally?
Well, it's more like that. Yeah. For all we can tell, the majority of the population was really, really unhappy with monetary conditions in Germany in the early 16th century.
I can imagine the unknowing of not knowing whether you actually have money, you've worked for it, but do you have money, or is it dud? Would be heartbreaking.
Yeah, it's really it made people unhappy. It created a lot of problems, and there's a reason for all these uprisings and rebellions we observe in the early 16th century. So this is important, and on the other hand, we can observe, and we have evidence for people in the second half of the 16th century, after the introduction of this common currency, to be much more happy about that. This currency was widely appreciated by people who used the money and whose life became really much easier because they could use it, and they could now rely on having money that was acceptable anywhere, that would not be debased secretly by someone who would basically produce underweight imitations and things like that. So conditions did become much, much better in the second half of the 16th century, and that by the end of the century, I would say the Holy Roman Empire was a well-governed country with a working currency, with a reasonable degree of security and all that kind of thing. I mean, there are accounts by English travelers who claim that roads were safer than in England or France in the late 16th century, and who used the money without any problem at all. So I think this is quite a good example for how a multilateral system can make life better for everybody. Even though it has problems, it's not straightforward. It's working very slowly. Decision making is complex, but still it makes life better.
I have to ask as well. So even though I've been to Zimbabwe and it's just a shit show in terms of currency, the cash points were empty, no one knew what they were doing, and people would rather have dollars. And this happens a lot, US dollars being used. Do you find people using the Holy Roman Empire's currency elsewhere, or are they developing their own systems at the same time?
Well, the top currency unit that was introduced at the end of the 1550s was the so-called thaler, which is a silver piece, pretty heavy, about 30 grams, and very valuable. And that was accepted not only within the empire, but in international trade basically anywhere. Initially only in Europe, but for example, in the 18th century, thalers were accepted in West Africa, in China, in America. The thaler is basically, it lent its name to the dollar. And it was used in Latin America And from then it basically migrated to North America and was then adopted by the US. So that's a really successful currency. And if you look at England, for example, in the 1550s, the English government began to issue so-called crowns, which were also a silver coin, a quarter of a pound, 60 pence. And if you look at a crown, it's basically the exact imitation of a thaler. Yeah. So this was really quite successful, and not only within the empire but beyond.
Oliver, thank you so much for coming on to fix us with some economic history. I think Chris and I were like, I don't actually know what this episode is going to be about, but it's been fascinating to find out about like something we never thought of, which is how you standardize a currency and get everybody to trust it, and when it happened and how it happened and how it affected everyday people. If you'd like to take a deep dive into the subject, you can, of course, buy Oliver's book, The Silver Empire, How Germany Created Its First Common Currency. Oliver, thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Our incredible guests give us 45 minutes of their time to join us and talk about their work or their new book. This is just a small taster. As a result, we have launched our very own bookshop on bookshop.org, where you can find our guests' latest books, you can support them, and you can support us on History Hack. 10% of every sale via our bookshop supports the podcast and allows us to keep going and bring you more top-of-the-line guests. You can find our bookshop at bookshop.org/shop/History Hack, or search for us in the shop section. Thank you so much for your continued support. We really appreciate our listeners and supporters. So make sure you get down to the bookshop and grab yourselves a new book.